Destination Africa, brought to you by Standard Bank.
We're putting in the spotlight today Africa's ICT sector. Still with us is Sharoda Rapeti. She's director at Deloitte TMT. Hennie Loubser is GM for Microsoft West, East, Central Africa and the Indian Ocean Islands. And then joining us from Abuja, Nigeria is Emeka Onyeama. He's CEO at Voix Networks. Thanks so much for staying with us. Let's continue this discussion in terms of opportunity, Hennie, because competition is certainly on the up. And so innovation is ranking high on the agenda at this stage. I mean, we've seen it within the telecom space specifically where, they've ventured into mobile money, for example, and that, spearheading the future of banking in the continent. So a turnaround in a completely different sector. To what extent is this spurring on a new kind of communications revolution?
I think the bottom line to that issue is that we need specific solutions for Africa. The mobile money is a very good example of something that emerged in Africa, and we're quite interested because we think that with the technologies, whether it's connectivity, the new devices, consumers playing such a big role in creating demand, that more and more new technology solutions will come into the fore that will create interesting opportunities. Cloud computing, I mentioned earlier, is one that allows developers of applications to have a much easier road to deploy their applications to consumers or to businesses. So there's enablers happening that will make it easier to leverage these new opportunities.
Let's take a look at cloud computing there, and from your experience with it, the kind of business case that it's put on the table for you, because it certainly seems to have opened up a new area of service demand.
Absolutely. The opportunity for business is to simplify how they run their ICT. The opportunity for consumers is to get access to new technologies and scenarios a lot quicker. The opportunity for innovators are to go and develop for new scenarios, new devices, new solutions, new applications. So we think across the board there's just fantastic opportunity. Our immediate opportunity is that we see that most of our technologies that people would want to run inside of their IT infrastructure today, we are now making available online, so people don't need to manage the complexity inside of the organizations, whether it's a business or a government. And therein we see a big opportunity for our business.
I'd love to add to that, because there's also all of the, we talked earlier on about how we don't have to follow, but how we can make that quantum leap forward. And that is such a solution that Hennie's described just now, where there's so many security benefits to just placing content in a cloud versus the individual implementation, which in itself is expensive, compared to the cloud implementation. I'd also like to pick up on the point that Hennie made on Africa is different, let's understand it differently. It's not a homogeneous continent, and with all of these devices and the availability of the different functionality on these devices, there's an opportunity to innovate on content that is specific to these colossal countries and geographies. And the last point I want to make is, the innovation behind mobile money. Can you imagine the success behind a single product in a single country, Kenya, where one product, the transactions on banking that take place in just that one product, our findings have shown, exceeds 20% of the country's GDP? On the mobile banking platform.
Absolutely. We know that Safaricom's been a pioneer in that regard. Emeka, when it comes to innovation in Nigeria, what scale are we seeing innovation happening at? What kind of side stream revenues are we seeing filter through and, investors taking advantage of?
I beg to disagree a little bit with the two speakers. In as much as emerging technologies are driving huge revenues in the developed world. My part of the world, which is Nigeria, lacks the basic infrastructure. And for you to come with new technologies in this part of the world, we need to develop the basic infrastructure that can support this new development. So as mobile banking and the rest of them are coming, we are losing focus of things like POS terminals, point of sale services, which are driven by fixed infrastructures. And we tend to move into mobility when we don't have these infrastructures to even for data references. Services like, like being able to, being able to locate or attribute an address to a subscriber is basically lacking in this part of the world because of infrastructure. While I see a shift towards the mobility services, we should not lose focus developing the basic infrastructure in Nigeria. So I don't see the movement of the advance of technology really doing much if the basic infrastructures are not there, if we have forgotten the plain old telephony systems, which actually adds to the mobility. So there's a whole lot to be done here, Alishia, that I feel that infrastructure should be the key focus.
Of course, Emeka highlighting a very important point there, in that you've got to have the support mechanisms in place to leverage off these opportunities we've been highlighting. Hennie, what do you think is needed to facilitate and then improve the development of the sector moving forward?
Yeah, there's no question that way more needs to be done in most countries in Africa in terms of infrastructure development. And it starts on different levels. Technology's got a role to play there, but a lot of work that we focused on in the last 5 years is to simply focus on capacity building, people capacity building in government when it comes to how do you govern ICT or how do you build basic services within the organization. So I think the people element is as important as the technology element when it comes to establishing the basic infrastructure. It's interesting that, when you look at ICT, you find that many of our partners are looking to build their own infrastructure in Africa in many countries in the form of data centers to help accelerate the pace at which infrastructure is established in these countries, because the investment opportunity clearly shows that there's a massive return potential.
Of course, Sharoda, I came across an interesting comment as well, that Nigeria, having one of the fastest growing telecoms markets in the world, as well as the largest subscriber base in sub-Saharan Africa, has an IT sector as a whole, that ICT sector as a whole, that accounts for 3.5% of GDP. So it's all about taking the next step, and it's challenges like this that seem to be impeding that step being taken.
Absolutely, Alishia. Countries need ICT policies, and ICT policies govern various aspects, which in turn attracts foreign direct investment, or, as we are seeing these days, the collaboration that Hennie is talking about. It's a collaborative effort by corporates, it's a collaborative effort by parties to address that infrastructure investment. So countries need ICT policies, and the ICT policies can range from everything to tax concessions, which then transition the country from importing technologies to producing themselves, to education, and that then leads to the industry being established. The industry being established leads to technologies and solutions being accessible not only to corporates, we are talking about consumers. So an ecosystem starts to develop over a period of time as the technology devices span over personal and company use. So agree with that 3%, it's low, but look at the potential latent within it if the basics are put into place and the ICT policies direct that kind of advancement.
Of course, Emeka, you've gotten consensus at the desk this evening. So let's take a look at another point that's been mooted by some governments over in Kenya. They've said that they're going to be refusing, or local authorities are going to be refusing to grant licenses moving forward for operators to lay their own fiber. They're looking at a sharing of infrastructure a little bit more aggressively. Here in South Africa, where we're hearing talk about local loop unbundling, bandied about. What's your take on that in terms of sharing of infrastructure and what that could do to facilitate a business like yours or impede it?
Yes, Alishia, I agree with the last speaker. Regulatory is very, very important, and policy is extremely very, very important as well. We in Nigeria, the regulatory body, I know, are doing the best they can, but we can do better by having policies that will secure the investment from overseas. At the same time, we can as well look inward, using our central banks or the local banks in developing what they call infrastructure funds that could be accessible by credible participators in the ICT industry. That way, we can have a speedy development in infrastructure that will support the new technologies like the one that you guys are talking about, cloud computing, mobile money, and the rest of them. So I believe that regulatory has a lot to do, and and policies are no-brainer to development of infrastructure anywhere in the world.
So Sharoda, what's your view on policy regarding the sharing of infrastructure?
Well, what we've observed in working with various parts of the world, we've observed that in developed economies, the markets become saturated. And in the Western world and in the European world, indeed, so much has been invested in infrastructure that all of the capacity has not even been lit up as yet, but the markets become saturated. Whereas in the developing economy, as we've heard from our colleague in Nigeria, the infrastructure is still very much in the initial stages, does not exist, has not connected within country and outside of country. The landing stations are still, an event occurring as we speak. So infrastructure is still a basic requirement. It hasn't as yet reached saturation stage. So regulatory plays an important part on the two sides. The one is enabling infrastructure, and in the saturated markets to bring down the cost, to pass on lower costs of access to users of the system. Then yes, co-location comes up. Yeah. We've seen one of the biggest coupling of 3 tier 1 operators in Europe. In the UK, which has never happened. It was unheard of before. Separate infrastructure for separate operator. And they are doing that for different reasons. So co-location has its place, but it has to play a specific role in enabling.
Yeah. Well, talking about coupling and partnerships, Hennie, I mean, Microsoft boasts an extensive partner network. What kind of leverage does something like that give you when you're trying to exploit this market?
Yeah, it's an important part of how we do business. Our partners come in different forms. When we look at the opportunity for ICT in Africa, we want our partners to become very strong. And particularly in this area, we think our partners will play the biggest role in providing the last mile of service or the value add service to our customers. We're ultimately a company that thinks of ourselves as enabling. We want to enable the efficiencies, we want to enable the success in Africa, and by providing the infrastructure and enabling technologies, we're hoping and we're working with our partners to really go and help develop those last mile of services and value additions.
Hennie, Sharoda, and Emeka, thanks so much for your time this evening, and thanks so much for joining us. Of course, we had Emeka Onyeama joining us from our studios in Abuja, Nigeria. He's the CEO of Voix Networks on that end. Sharoda Rapeti is director at Deloitte TMT, and then Hennie Loubser is GM for Microsoft West, East, Central Africa, and the Indian Ocean Islands.